I'm assuming that if you're watching this video, odds are you're at least somewhat familiar with the Donkey Kong Country series, which means you most likely consider the second game to be the pinnacle of the original three. Some people will cite the original as their favorite, but rarely is the third one mentioned. I know it would be foolish to argue the third game directly against the second, as it truly is a masterpiece. And I won't be trying to argue that Donkey Kong Country 2 is worse than you think. Rather, I feel that the worlds of each game exist in a complementary state. And that's the best place for us to start. The worlds. Let's start at the beginning. The original Donkey Kong Country takes place on DK Island, appropriately enough, and despite being a tropical setting primarily, it features a variety of environments, from tropical jungles and arboreal forests, to forgotten ruins and dilapidated mines, along with the more unlikely glacial mountaintop and polluted industrial zones. If you were to summarize the world of Donkey Kong Country, it would be like an island adventure. In fact, you can even describe it as similar to an Indiana Jones adventure, just without all the Nazis and face melting. Donkey Kong Country 2, on the other hand, decides to go with a more extreme approach to world building. The game starts on an improbably large pirate ship, which the Kremlings have apparently crashed into their own island the moment they got home, followed up by a cavernous lava zone inside of a volcano, an overgrown and polluted swamp, an area that's half theme park and half massive beehive, complete with roller coaster minecart levels and levels based around sticky honey inside of the massive beehive, followed up by a haunted forest, then a medieval castle, and finally finishing up on an airship above the clouds. The world of Donkey Kong Country 2 is one big theme park, in one instance literally, where each zone is its own attraction and fully dedicated to each individual theme over any kind of overarching cohesion. And this isn't necessarily a bad thing. It allows for each zone to have a potentially more unique theme than if it had to follow some sense of progression that occurs naturally. But let's move on to the subject of the video. Now, at first glance, it might seem like Donkey Kong Country 3 returns to the thematics of the first, opting for a more nature-based adventure. And while this isn't wrong, it also doesn't tell the full story. Donkey Kong Country 3 takes place in the Northern Cremisphere, a fictional world most similar to Northern Europe and Canada in real life, leaving behind the island setting of the previous games for a more continental approach. Peaceful lakes, sprawling forests, beautiful waterfalls, towering mountains, and rocky cliffs all give off a real sense of natural beauty brought to life by the exquisite pre-rendered 3D graphics. The world of Donkey Kong Country 3 is vibrant, relaxing, more similar to a European vacation than the trip to Disneyland that Donkey Kong Country 2 is, both great in their own way. Even though the bulk of Rare's development force had moved on to developing for the N64 at this point, with the N64 and Donkey Kong Country 3 releasing within mere months of each other, you can see the mastery of their 3D pre-rendered art form when it comes to Donkey Kong Country 3. The lakeside levels feature a detailed forest-covered mountain in the background, beautifully reflected in the shimmering surface of the water. The riverside levels are dense with forest and foliage, with bright flowers and ferns packed along the riverside path. The underwater levels keep the tropical aesthetic of the previous games, but trade in muted blues and rocky barriers for a brightly colored and dense coral reef brimming with colorful variety. The industrial levels also take on a new look, having a distinctly older, more industrial revolution style appearance compared to the more slick contemporary style seen in the original game. Rusted and oxidated metal tones combine with steam pipes and massive smelters for a fully realized old industrial feel. Even the rocky cliff levels have outcrops of flowers and grass, along with a beautifully detailed canyon river in the background, giving a real sense of existing in a real world. In addition to the beautiful levels, the overworld map itself is a treat to look at. Shimmering water and flowing waterfalls, fields of flowers and groves of trees, combine with detailed terrain, giving the world map a sense of existing as a real world and not just serving as a level select screen. I think this realness also shines through in that the world looks lived in. We see houses, cabins, and wharfs that seem to exist outside of the Kremlin occupation of the area. It feels like a real place you could actually live in. The strong visuals just tell one half of the story, however. I'd also like to take a moment and talk about the soundtrack. Composed primarily by Evelyn Novakovic, Evelyn Fisher at the time, it's widely regarded as the weakest in the trilogy, and while I might not disagree entirely, I can't help but feel that it's still underrated for just how strong it is. Taken as a whole, the Donkey Kong Country trilogy features some of the best music of its time for a video game, and possibly of all time. Catchy hooks and clever compositions that both work around and take advantage of the limited sound chip in the Super Nintendo have resulted in a musical legacy that rivals that of legendary Japanese composers of the time like Koji Kondo and Nobuo Uematsu. Here's some of the many unique tracks featured in Donkey Kong Country 3. Now that we've talked about the world of Donkey Kong Country 3, let's talk about the gameplay changes. Each game in the series features new mechanics and ideas that expand on the core gameplay, and none more so than this one. Your playable characters this time around are Dixie Kong, returning from Donkey Kong Country 2, and new addition to the series, Kiddy Kong, who is essentially a giant toddler version of Donkey Kong. Originally, Rare planned to have Donkey Kong as a playable character again, but didn't want him to overshadow Dixie Kong as the starring role. Kiddy Kong's inclusion from a mechanics perspective actually corrects one of the bigger issues with the previous game. I didn't actually notice this until I was playing it again as an adult, but the problem with Dixie and Diddy is that Diddy is simply better at everything that wasn't gliding a long distance. He moves faster and jumps higher than Dixie, making him the ideal choice for most of the game. However, Kiddy Kong returns to the original game's strong versus fast approach to the player duo. Dixie Kong is faster and has more horizontal mobility while gliding. Kiddy Kong has more reach and can take out enemies that Dixie can't. He also has a surface skimming ability while rolling that, while situational, is critical in getting to bonus areas. The team-up ability also returns to this game with a few significant changes. Kiddy can throw Dixie a great distance, allowing her to reach areas normally far out of a normal jumping reach. Dixie, however, can only throw Kiddy a small distance, but his mass will smash through weakened floorboards, usually leading to bonus rooms and secret paths. Furthermore, he rolls when thrown horizontally and can be ridden on top of like a steel barrel. Speaking of steel barrels, they're back in this game for the single purpose of collecting DK coins, which are now held by an enemy called a coin, who wields the coin itself as a shield and angles it to prevent any kind of direct attack. To acquire the DK coin in any level usually requires the player to throw the steel barrel over the coin and have it rebound, striking him in his exposed back. Sometimes it's as easy as taking a few steps past the end of the level, but other times it's much more of a puzzle requiring some significant thought or exploration. This adds to the challenge of collecting the DK coin from each level, while also adding variety. This leads me into another thing that Donkey Kong Country 3 improved significantly on, which is collectibles. While far from the collectathon waking nightmare that was Donkey Kong 64, Donkey Kong Country 3 did introduce some new items. These include bear coins and bonus coins, which act as replacements for banana coins and creme coins respectively from the second game, along with banana birds, which are usually acquired from a simple Simon Says puzzle game you encounter in secret cave locations across the world, and are required to be collected to see the secret ending. Thankfully, however, knowing where you still need to collect DK coins and bonus coins is no longer a guessing game, as each level on the overworld map will have two flags on it, either a blue or pink flag, representing Kiddy or Dixie being the one to finish it, and a smaller golden flag representing the DK coin. These flags will hang off the pole if their corresponding coins have not been collected from the level, but once they've been fully collected, will fly in the wind. This easily lets you know whether or not you are done with a level and can move on to the next. In addition to this, there's an assortment of single-use items that are acquired and usually traded to and from Brother Bears or brought to Funky to acquire new vehicles for the overworld. Despite these added items, it feels significantly less stressful to attempt a full completion run thanks to the flag post mechanic. An assortment of new barrels include the tracker barrels, which move underneath you as you fly through the air, ghost barrels, which disappear and reappear pointing in a different direction, and booster barrels, which will fire you up like a rocket and then shoot you out at the end of the path. These mostly function as slight variants on already existing barrels. It also features an assortment of returning and new faces in the animal companions. On Guard and Squawks return, making them the only companions to show up in all three games, along with Squitter from Donkey Kong Country 2. The new animal companions are Perry, who is a small bird that stays above the Kongs and collects items for them, and the much more interesting Ellie the elephant, who acts as a replacement for Rambi in the only game where he doesn't appear. Whereas Rambi excelled at charging into enemies while taking no damage, Ellie excels at ranged combat similar to Squitter. She has a water meter that is filled up through either being in water or using the L key on a surface of water or next to a waterfall to suck it in like a vacuum. This ability also allows her to pull barrels to her trunk, hold them, and launch them at high velocity. Ellie also has a unique mechanic that, while only used twice, has to be mentioned, which is her fear of sneaks, the basic rat enemy, that causes her to bolt away uncontrollably whenever she sees one. Speaking of unique levels, of course, what would these games be without unique, engaging levels? And Donkey Kong Country 3 delivers on that in spades. I'll cover just one in each world, but so many levels feature mechanics unique to them in this game. In Lake Orangutanga, we have Murky Mill, which features Ellie the Elephant in a darkened mill level with swinging lights and sneaks patrolling underneath them, requiring careful use of barrels and timing jumps with both the lights and the sneak's movement to avoid being startled. Riverside Race in Crimwood Forest takes place on the Riverside tile set and features a ticking timer at the bottom of the screen that clocks your completion time. To encourage you to keep moving, a swarm of bees will chase you throughout the level, only letting up if you're underwater. Completing it fast enough unlocks the path to a banana bird cave, thanks to Brash the bear knocking a log down the river. Cotton Top Grove features Fish Food Frenzy, where you have an animal companion of sorts named Nibla, a hungry fish that follows behind you and eats nearby enemies. The catch being that you must feed him the non-spiky fish, or he'll turn red and attack the Kongs instead. Feeding him spiky fish will only result in him getting angrier faster. Mechanos features a number of unique mechanics, but the most notable is in Low G Labyrinth, which uses the Pipes tile set filled with a green fog that causes the Kongs to move slowly and are able to jump very high. To complete this level requires very precise platforming and planning skills. In K3, Crackshot Croc has a sniper trained on you the entire level, following the Kongs around with crosshairs until he locks on and fires. To go along with this, you play as Squitter for most of the level, requiring careful planning of platforms to avoid being stuck in the crosshairs with nowhere to go. Razor Ridge has Kong Fused Cliffs, which has the players climbing a vertical fuse that's been lit, having to dodge enemies attacking from the sides and avoiding the fire below them from reaching. Finally, in Chaos Core, the level Lightning Lookout features the wonderful lightning strike mechanic, which you must avoid being struck by on land and also avoid being caught underwater if it strikes the surface. This is not including the wide variety of levels also found in the Lost World. Now, that's not to say these unique level types are necessarily always a positive thing. The final standard level in the world, Poisonous Pipeline, has you swimming through the entire level with reversed controls, which can be frustrating to say the least. However, despite this and a few other not-so-great unique mechanic levels, the sheer amount of variety is truly wonderful. And before we reach the end, I would also like to mention the incredible thought and design work put into the boss fights. Each boss fight is unique and clever in its design, with Squirt the Crab and Barbos the Urchin utilizing animal transformations to fight, much like King Zing in the second game. And when you fight Bleak, the snowman, it uses the mechanics of Swanky's sideshow throwing minigame. In fact, the only disappointing boss is sadly K. Rool himself, being quite a static and boring fight that requires nowhere near the same skill he did as in the previous game. So, where does that leave us? I can only hope that I've convinced you to maybe reconsider your thoughts on Donkey Kong Country 3. Or, if you were already a fan of it, I hope I may have helped in explaining why. I understand why it's the oddball of the series, being such a thematic departure from the incredible second game, and releasing at a time when the next big thing was blocky polygons and low-res textures, not pre-rendered sprite work. But time has truly been kind to it. While those games aged poorly visually and now appear rough to say the least, and their mechanics often age just as poorly, Donkey Kong Country 3 has persevered, and it still stands the test of time as a fitting finale to the best trilogy of its generation. Thank you for watching.